letter that changed the world. December 1940. London is a city defined by the smell of cordite and the sound of shattering glass. The Battle of Britain has technically been won in the skies. But on the ground, the Blitz is tearing the nervous system of the nation apart. The nights are long, freezing, and lit only by the fires of burning docks in the East End. In the underground cabinet war rooms, beneath the government buildings of Whitehall, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and existential dread. Winston Churchill sits at his desk. To the public, he is the bulldog, the unshakable symbol of British defiance, who promised to fight on the beaches. But in the privacy of this bunker, Churchill is a man staring into the abyss. He picks up his pen to write a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. This letter will go down in history as a masterpiece of rhetoric, a plea for the survival of Western civilization. But beneath the eloquent prose lies a humiliating secret that the British government has kept hidden from its own people, from the Germans, and from the world. The British Empire, the entity that covers a quarter of the globe, the superpower that defeated Napoleon, the banker of the 19th century, is not just running out of ammunition, it is running out of money. It is undeniably, catastrophically broke. Churchill's letter was a masterful dance. He had to beg for a lifeline without looking like a beggar. He had to admit that the empire's pockets were empty without causing a panic in the global markets. He wrote that the moment was fast approaching when the British Treasury could no longer pay cash for the ships, planes, and shells needed to keep the Nazis at bay. What Churchill didn't realize, as he signed that letter, was that he wasn't just asking for a loan. He was initiating a transfer of global power so absolute that it would change the hierarchy of nations forever. He was inviting the United States, not just to help Britain, but to acquire it. This is the story of the Invoice for World War II, the ruthless financial maneuvering that stripped an empire of its wealth, its bases, and its future, all while saving it from destruction. To understand the sheer magnitude of this collapse, we first have to understand the height from which Britain fell. When the war broke out in September 1939, Britain was a financial behemoth. It held nearly $4.5 billion in gold and dollar reserves. It was the world's largest creditor. British aristocrats and companies owned vast swathes of the global economy, railroads in Argentina, nitrate mines in Chile, oil fields in the Middle East, and massive manufacturing plants inside the United States itself. The City of London was the beating heart of global insurance and shipping. The sun didn't just never set on the British territory, it never set on British dividends. But the war Hitler unleashed was a different beast. It was total, mechanized warfare. It didn't just consume soldiers, it consumed industrial output at a rate that defied all economic logic. Britain, an island nation, had to import almost everything: steel, aluminum, oil, rubber, and food. With the fall of France and the blockade of the continent, Britain's usual trading partners vanished overnight. There was only one store left open in the world: the United States of America. However, in 1939 and 1940, the United States was not an ally. It was a neutral observer, deeply suspicious of European wars. The American public, scarred by the memories of World War I, had no interest in sending their sons to die in foreign mud again. Congress, reflecting this isolationist mood, had passed the Neutrality Acts. Buried within these acts was a clause that would drain the lifeblood of the British economy: cash and carry. The rule was simple and brutal. If you wanted American supplies, you could have them, but there would be no credit, no loans, no IOUs. You had to pay in gold or US dollars, cash on the barrelhead, before the goods were even loaded onto the ships. For the first year of the war, Britain dutifully emptied its vaults. In a daring and secret mission codified as Operation Fish, the British government loaded the nation's entire gold reserve, billions of dollars in bullion, onto battleships and fast ocean liners. They sailed through U-boat-infested waters to ship the wealth of the empire to vaults in Canada and the Federal Reserve. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth in human history. They paid every bill, they honored every contract, but the burn rate was unsustainable. By late 1940, the cash and carry was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington sat in offices piling up with contracts for planes and tanks that they physically could not sign because the Treasury in London had confirmed a terrifying truth: the coffers were empty. When Roosevelt received Churchill's desperate letter, he understood the geopolitical stakes immediately. If Britain fell, the Atlantic Ocean would become a German lake. and the United States would be next. But Roosevelt was a political animal. He couldn't just hand money to the British. It was illegal under American law, and political suicide with the voters. He needed a rebrand. He needed to sell the concept of aid, not as charity, but as a hard-headed defense strategy. This birthed the genius of Lend-Lease. Roosevelt sold it to the press with a folksy, disarming analogy. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. I don't say to him before that operation, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over.'" It sounded generous. It sounded simple. It sounded like the American way. But behind closed doors in Washington, the reality was not a neighborly exchange of gardening equipment. It was a foreclosure proceeding. The man guarding the American Treasury was Henry Morgenthau Jr. He was a staunch anti-fascist who desperately wanted to defeat Hitler. But he was also the fiercely protective guardian of the American taxpayer. Morgenthau operated on a strict principle. The United States would not give a single dime of aid until Britain had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it had stripped itself of every last liquid asset it possessed. Morgenthau didn't just want a promise, he wanted an audit. He demanded the British negotiators reveal the location and value of every asset owned by the British government and every private asset owned by British citizens anywhere in the world. He wanted to know the value of every woolen sock, every shell casing, and every share of stock. The British negotiators, led by the exhausted Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned. They were being treated like a bankrupt company in receivership, not an ally holding the line against tyranny. Phillips argued that selling off long-term investments during a war would be a fire sale. They would get pennies on the dollar. He argued that stripping Britain of its overseas income meant the country would be destitute after the war, unable to feed its population. Morgenthau remained unmoved. His logic was cold-blooded. Why should a farmer in Iowa pay taxes to build a tank for Britain, if a British lord still owned a profitable factory in New Jersey? The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the case of the American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was a titan of industry, owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in North America. It was a jewel in the crown of British overseas investments, highly profitable, stable, and a crucial source of dollars for the British economy. Morgenthau saw it as a target. He needed a sacrificial lamb to show the skeptical US Congress that the British were truly bleeding. The Lend-Lease bill was stuck in committee, with isolationists arguing that Britain was actually hiding wealth and trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau told the British flatly, "Sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies." The British government was cornered. In a move that shocked the City of London, they seized the company from its private owners under emergency war powers. They didn't ask, they took. On March 15, 1941, the sale was pushed through because everyone on Wall Street knew the British were desperate sellers who had to sell by a deadline. The American investment bankers circled like sharks. They drove a merciless bargain. A company worth over $100 million was sold for roughly $54 million. It wasn't a sale, it was a heist. The dollars from the sale went straight into the US Treasury to pay for existing orders of rifles and aircraft engines. Meanwhile, the British government had to reimburse the original owners in pounds, increasing their domestic debt while losing a critical foreign asset. This was the moment the British elite realized the true nature of the special relationship. They were not partners, they were a junior entity being stripped of assets to pay for their survival. The US was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. The liquidation wasn't limited to stocks and shares. It soon extended to the very dirt and sand of the empire itself. While the financial men argued over ledgers, the Royal Navy was facing a crisis in the Atlantic. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The lifeline to North America was being severed. Churchill, desperate, begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers. These were World War I-era relics, rusting in mothballs, barely seaworthy, and of little value to the modern US Navy. Roosevelt agreed, but again, there was a price tag. He wouldn't give them away. He proposed a trade dot in exchange for 50 obsolete ships. The United States demanded 99-year rent-free leases on a string of British naval and air bases across the Atlantic. From Newfoundland and Canada to the Bahamas, Jamaica, Saint Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana paused to consider the scale of that trade. Britain handed over the strategic keys to the Western Hemisphere. They allowed the United States to build military fortresses on British sovereign territory bases that would project American power for 50 old ships that required months of repair before they could even sail. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain was trading its long-term imperial footprint for short-term tactical survival. It was the act of a desperate man pawning his family heirlooms to buy a sandwich. By March 1941, when the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. The US investments were sold. The bases were leased. The treasury was empty. Lend-Lease turned on the tap. It provided the food, oil, and weaponry that kept Britain in the war. Without it, the Nazis would almost certainly have starved the British Isles into submission. But the aid was a lease, and leases have terms and conditions. Buried in the dense diplomatic text of the agreement was Article 7. To the casual observer, it looked like boring legalese. In reality, it was a poison pill designed to kill the British Empire as an economic unit. Article 7 stated that, in return for aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall that held the empire together. It was a system of tariffs that made trade between Britain and its colonies India, Australia, Canada cheaper than trade with outsiders. It guaranteed markets for British goods. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own defenses. They were agreeing to open their protected markets to American exporters. The US was using its leverage to ensure that, once the shooting stopped, American factories which had doubled in size and efficiency during the war would have unrestricted access to the world's consumers. The British negotiators fought it. They knew it was a death warrant for their trading bloc. But with German bombers overhead and the vaults empty, they had no leverage. They signed as the war turned in 1942 and the US entered the fight. The disparity only grew. Britain cannibalized its economy for the war effort, converting every factory to military production and abandoning its export markets in Latin America and Asia. American companies, meanwhile, happily stepped into the void. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios for the global market. By 1945, the transfer of wealth was absolute. The financial center of gravity had shifted from London to New York and Washington. Then came the final betrayal. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. In London, crowds danced in the streets. Strangers hugged. Bonfires were lit. It was a moment of pure, delirious joy. But across the Atlantic, the American bureaucratic machine didn't pause for sentimentality. 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that devastated the British economy more effectively than the Luftwaffe ever could. He signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease. Immediately, there was no transition period, no soft landing. American Liberty ships, loaded with wheat and meat bound for hungry Liverpool, were ordered to turn around in the middle of the ocean and sail back to the US. The lifeline was cut. The British government was paralyzed. They had assumed the aid would continue during the Reconstruction. John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economic mind of the century and advisor to the government, looked at the numbers and saw financial Dunkirk. Britain was importing half its food and raw materials, paying with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, the country was insolvent. Not in a year, but instantly. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was sick, exhausted, and suffering from the heart condition that would soon kill him. He went not as an intellectual giant, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He planned to look the Americans in the eye and argue that Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had bankrupted itself to save Western civilization. Therefore, the US should give Britain a gift-a-grant of $6 billion as a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had spent holding the line. He called it justice. But when he arrived in Washington, he found that justice was not a currency the US Treasury recognized. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of the new socialist Labour government in London. The American negotiators, led by the steely Fred Vinson, offered no gifts. They offered a loan, and not a friendly loan, but a commercial loan with interest. $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and it came with strings attached that were designed to strangle the last remnants of British financial independence. The Americans demanded sterling convertibility. They insisted that within 1 year, Britain must make the pound fully exchangeable for US dollars. Keynes knew this was a trap. He knew that the world was hungry for American goods, not British ones. If people could swap their pounds for dollars, they would do it instantly, draining the loan in weeks. He fought until his health broke, but the alternative was starvation. Bitterly, the British Parliament accepted the loan, calling it a financial Munich. Keynes died shortly after, his heart giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But his prediction came true with terrifying accuracy. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried the UK, coal piles froze, power stations shut down. In unheated homes, victors of the war shivered in the dark. Bread, which was never rationed even during the height of the U-boat war, was rationed in peacetime. On July 15, 1947, per the American demand, Britain made the pound convertible. The result was a massacre. The world rushed to sell pounds and buy dollars. The loan money evaporated. In just 5 weeks, the British government had to slam the window shut and suspend convertibility, admitting total failure. The humiliation was complete. In February 1947, Britain sent a secret telegram to the US State Department, essentially resigning from its role as a world power. They admitted they could no longer afford to support the anti-communist governments in Greece and Turkey. They were handing the baton of global leadership to Washington, not because they wanted to, but because the checks were bouncing. The payments on the Anglo-American loan of 1946 continued for 6 decades. Through the boom of the 50s, the decline of the 70s, the Thatcher years, and the Blair years, the British Treasury wrote a check to the US government every single year. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. Think about that. 60 years after the guns fell silent, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The story of this financial bill is the ultimate debunking of the idea that wars have winners. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game for the combatants. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Britain won the war and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States. The US economy doubled in size. Its industry was untouched. It ended the war holding 2/3 of the world's gold. And through the ruthless mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it successfully dismantled the British Empire, opening global markets for American dominance. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it in a distressed asset sale. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter in the dark, December of 1940, he saved his country from Hitler, but he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice, but the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the rubble as a moral giant, but an economic ghost, having spent its inheritance to buy freedom for the world.